And I wanted to just update the group in terms of where we are as a U.S. beef industry and implementation of genomic selection. And so I've got a table in here that actually kind of shows the status by breed, but there's a few things I want to discuss before we get to that point. I've used this slide several times before, and so you guys, I'm sure, have seen it, but I often put in slides just because there's a particular point I want to make, not just because all of the information's necessarily relevant, but this is where we were really pre-2009. We had genetic merit estimates based on genomic information only, and they were published in a disjoint fashion from the products of our national cattle evaluation, which of course are EPDs. So some of us probably even put together, or if we didn't, we saw sale catalogs that had this information in there, and it was really confusing. So how do you begin to weight these molecular breeding values for things like ribeye area or dry matter intake or even marbling against EPDs for those same traits? Right? And that's what our commercial clientele were faced with before we augmented our EPDs with genomics. And I would argue that some of us, not me, but some of us are fighting to get back to this paradigm. And I don't understand why. I absolutely don't understand why, as a breeder, when you have an EPD for a trait, you fight so hard to also have access to the molecular breeding value. Because I don't understand what additional information you think you're garnering. I just don't. I think it adds a tremendous source of confusion. So if we take a historical look at this, Simmental would argue that they were the first to have really a marker-assisted EPD, and that's for the trait of tenderness. Probably as we think about genomic selection, though, we think forward to 2009, 2010, where the American Angus Association were really the first ones to merge at that time what we would consider would that be an ultra low density panel, right, that had 384 SNPs that was included into national cattle evaluation. And that was done so using a correlated trade approach, which Mike McNeil made widely known, but Steve Katchman actually developed a couple years prior to that. So the efficacy of this technology isn't binary. So I know as those of us in extension animal breeding, we receive the question quite commonly, does it work? That was a foolish question once we went down this path, because it's not a matter of does it work, it's how well it works. So you'll notice that Steve and I use the phrase evaluation. We don't like validation. Validation seems so much like it receives a yes or no answer. So instead, we like to say we evaluated it, and here's how well it worked. I don't know that that phrase is caught on, Steve, but that's what we use in our shop anyway. And it's really centered on the gain in EPD accuracy, which is related to how much of the genetic variation that genomic predictor actually described. So the step taken by the American Angus Association obviously was a tremendous first step. It allowed simplification. We no longer had these disjoint and competing sources of information. Conceptually, it was appealing. The molecular breeding value is just another piece of information that's correlated to what we really want to change, and it allowed for this genomic information to affect or impact more than just the animal that was genotyped. However, as we increase the number of companies in the market space, we increase the number of tests, versions of tests, that could add complexity here. If they're all using different prediction equations, so now we could have a molecular breeding value from company 1 for trait 1, molecular breeding value from company 2 for the same trait, and so on and so forth. So at the time, we were worried about the complexity of these kinds of multiple trait models. And the other assumption that this makes is that that molecular breeding value actually predicts all animals equally as well. Other breeds then made an investment, and I would argue that investment in developing their own training populations leveraged R&D work going on. The 2000 Bull Project from US Mark, a lot of genotyping work that had been done at the University of Missouri. The Weight Trait Project was really a NBC, EC, US, Mark, UNL collaboration, many of those breeders in the room, and of course there are other projects that allowed some of these breeds to develop that training population that they needed. And then there was a paradigm shift where breeds decided they wanted to own their own destiny. They didn't necessarily want to have to rely solely on companies to do the training and evaluation process for them. They actually wanted to be able to work with universities, and through the NBCEC and Dorian Garrick at Iowa State, he obviously did an awful lot of work in this arena, developing those initial training sets and doing the exercise for a lot of the beef breeds. Now I would argue this process of training and evaluation is really a partnership, depending on the breed, between companies, so for instance GeneSeek and Zoetis, which are both represented in the room, the respective breed associations, and depending on the breed association, various universities as well. So the method with which this information is included into our EPDs really depends on who's running the genetic evaluation. And the choice, I'd like to tell you, is based off of all kinds of rigorous model comparison, and it's not. It's made based on what software does that organization have available to them now, and how can they make it work, right? So it's software availability and choice that drives the method that breed associations use, right? And that's the fact of the matter. So here's probably the slide that people wanted to see. These are the breeds, at least to my knowledge, that have implemented genomic selection. So utilize this in the routine national cattle evaluation. There are other breeds that are poised and ready to do so. For instance, Shorthorn, Solaire, Beefmaster, probably some others. If I left your breed off and you're upset, sorry, that wasn't with malice aforethought. These are the number of animals genotyped that are included in national cattle evaluation as of a couple of weeks ago. The caveat to that is these two American breeds, these counts are dated by about a year. Those are October 2015 numbers. This column, LD impute, says, does the breed offer a low density panel and impute that up to a higher density? The benefit of course, of low density is it's cheaper. So that's the benefit to the breeder. The benefit to a company is it's cheaper, so they should, and I hope they do, sell more of them, right? Now, I think that's happened. In some cases, that actually the availability of a low-density panel has spurred many breeders to genotype more animals than they would have previously. Part of the problem with this, though, is that if you're going to impute, which is nothing more than filling in the missing blanks, okay, if you're going to impute, there need to be relatives, hopefully not too far away in the pedigree, that have higher density information. So that means over time, you need to go back in and ensure that critical animals are regenotyped with high density to enable accurate imputation going forward. Now, if I'm a breeder, okay, and Joe comes to me and says, hey, Matt, congratulations, your bull is being used widely. We want you to go back in and pay to have him regenotyped. I'm going to say, yeah, it was nice being a member of NOLF. I'm going to move on, right? So what breed associations have had to do in many cases is actually subsidize this regenotyping at higher density. So behind the scenes, and admittedly, I think in ad hoc fashion, drawing a line in the sand saying when a sire has X number of calves registered, they reach a critical threshold and accuracy value for some EPD, whatever it is, we're going to take the decision to go in and regenotype them to allow accurate imputation going forward. This, and Sue and Stuart, I hope I'm right here, this is the company that the breeds work with. GS is GeneSeek, Z is Zoetis. If I'm incorrect on that list, you can chime in and tell me where I'm incorrect. I would also throw out that this number relative to Angus, there's about another 26,000 animals genotyped with that Legacy 384 panel, and that's still included in their national cattle evaluation. This method, that's the method with which the Breed Association includes genomics into their EPDs. Core is that correlated trade approach. Blend is some of what Steve talked about. It's really indexing. I'll go over those two in more detail. And this is a single-step genomic BLUP, really making use of the SNP information to inform more accurate relationships between animals. Okay, so this is the testable material, particularly to those two rows back there. Right, this is the correlated trade approach, and I stole this example from Mike McNeil in 2010. He did this with Angus data, but this is our traditional mixed model equations where before we would have said, right, we've got intermuscular fat records coming in, marbling records coming in. This is what we're interested in changing. IMF is just an indicator trait. So we run those two traits together in the same model. Now we said we've got another piece of information, a genomic piece, which I'm calling a molecular breeding value. So now we're just going to expand this to include 3 traits. All these X's and Z's and E's, these have to do with the fixed effects, things like contemporary group, maybe age and weight are germane to this trait. The only fixed effects really associated with the genomics piece is an intercept. Okay, we're not worried about contemporary group information there. These are the breeding values we're interested in estimating, and these are the residual errors. Okay, so this is what AGI, Angus Genetics Inc., does now for Angus cattle and for Charolais cattle. Blending, this is post-evaluation. So after we calculated the EPDs, we go in and index EPDs and the genomics piece together. And we don't do that by sitting down and saying, I think genomics is twice as important as the EPD. Okay, it's a bit more detailed than that. The nice thing is it sits within the framework of any software used by breed associations or the NCE providers. In theory, Steve, it should be pretty simple, but you got to do it correctly. Okay, you got to do it correctly. And so here's how that works. And Steve immediately said, well, what's that one? He's the one person in the audience that probably picked up on that. That's supposed to be an I, and I know that was really bugging the rest of you out here. So I apologize for that error. But we want to develop a breeding value, or half of a breeding value is an EPD, and we want to develop that using our traditional breeding value and the molecular breeding value. And so we weight them proportional to the amount of variation that they're explaining in the trait we're interested in. So to Steve's comment earlier, if we had perfect information about this animal already, okay, imagine, which it can't happen, but imagine we knew this breeding value with perfect certainty, accuracy of 1. What happens then, this is the reliability of that animal's EBV, and this is the squared genetic correlation between the molecular breeding value and the trait of interest. If we knew this with perfect certainty, this weighting goes to 0, and the molecular breeding value contributes nothing. Okay, so for very high accuracy animals, we're not going to gain a lot of information by including an MBV into their genetic merit prediction. But for low accuracy animals, we can get a benefit. This is the method used by everyone other than the 2 American breeds I talked about earlier, Angus and Charolais. Every other breed uses this method. So pretty much ignore all of those columns because these are numbers as of a year ago, so that may be interesting for you to look at. Those were the counts as of a year ago. But moving forward, every breed has said they're going to use some kind of single-step implementation. So how many of you have heard of Bolt software? So maybe half or a third of you, which I find amazing. Never before have I heard so much discussion in the industry and in popular press over software used for genetic evaluation. Never before. And I've heard that Bolt's going to cure everything. It's going to be amazing. Okay, the fact is it represents probably the largest change in genetic evaluation software we've seen in the beef industry for a long time. All these breeds, a year ago I would have told you, most of them that are currently blending now would be using Bolt by this meeting, and all the breed execs told me we will be by early 2017. So in early 2017, hopefully I don't have to tell you by mid-2017 or by late 2017, okay? But this change is going to occur. So these kinds of single-step methods, essentially there's two camps of software providers, University of Georgia with Ignacy Mistal and group, and then Theta Solutions / ISU in a hybrid model, really methodology driven by Rohan Fernando, software provided by Golden and Garrick. And the fundamental difference, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, is one camp says, I think all SNPs contribute equally to the prediction of an animal's genetic merit, and the other method says, wait a second, I think some SNPs are more important in the prediction of the genetic merit for a given trait than other SNPs are. So you'll hear argument about those two things. I think fundamentally, we've yet to see exactly what the tangible differences are in side-by-side comparison of those two. So Mark Thalman's not here today, but he's given a lot of thought to this issue of bias, and I want to make a couple of comments here. Is that one, early on, there's no doubt we had bias in genomic training because we highly selected the set of animals in training. If you think about it, Arlen, if you're a high-accuracy Angus bull, my guess is you probably have a fairly good marbling EPD, and you're probably fairly good for calving ease direct, generally speaking. So when we targeted high-accuracy bulls for training, we automatically ensured that we had only the really good ones for a few traits. So that makes developing prediction equations problematic. Now, I think for some breeds in particular, we've gotten over that hurdle because we started genotyping more and more animals, and more importantly, I really commend the breeders that are genotyping entire contemporary groups. So the reason why you want to do that is I've never understood the point of genotyping animals after you've put together your sale list. I'll tell you why we genotype at the university seed stock herd. We genotype shortly after birth, and I use that information to tell me which animals I want to promote through the system. So I use those early predictions, those early genomically enhanced EPDs, to tell me which bulls I should go ahead and put on feed that are candidates to be in the sale. So I use that information to take a decision. If you genotype at the end, what decision is there left to make? Right? Then it's for advertising's sake. It's not to make a decision. And this information should enable us to make more accurate decisions. So moving forward, I think we've made tremendous progress in the beef industry. Dare talked about indices. 2004, 2005, the first index published by a major beef breed association was Angus. I think those years are pretty close. First paper published on indices, 1943. So we were a little bit slow out of the gate on that one. Genomics, though, I think we've jumped on fairly quickly. And I think that's a success story for our industry. There's more work to do, though, and there's going to be evolutions in terms of statistical methodology, evolutions in terms of the biology as well, and in national cattle evaluation platforms. Because we can't just continue to make it fit with whatever system we have. So here's the other concern I have relative to genomics, and that's understanding. So the single thing that stood out to me the most in the genomic selection era is that the majority of beef seed stock producers never understood EPD and accuracy to begin with. Obviously not this crowd, it's those colleagues of yours that didn't come. And at some point this will manifest itself, and I fear we run the risk of, you can fill in the blanks there if you want, up the end game. Okay? The fundamentals are still in place. It's still these breeding values or EPDs and truly understanding what accuracy is. If we haven't captured those things, genomics is a complete waste on us. So I know later on this afternoon we'll talk about novel traits, those things that are economically relevant, as opposed to what you guys maybe saw printed in the program for this and news outlets. There was a word added, not economically relevant. They are economically relevant. That's what I get for not proofreading. But they're sparsely collected. And there we're going to do training like Steve talked about on phenotypes, probably not on these deregressed breeding values. I worry about the expensive data collection for an individual firm leading to these highly selected training sets. You can think about feed intake and the expense associated with that. And I think the only way around bias is implementing some of these multiple trait models where we have things that are routinely recorded, perhaps like weight, coupled with something that's sparsely recorded. So to summarize, I don't know how quick I've been, but I know I'm almost done. Phenotypes are still critical to collect. And I know we've harped on that and harped on it and harped on it. And I also know as a breeder, you're saying, I get that, Matt, but I'm adding an extra $45 or $85 per animal to my overhead costs. And a lot of you have looked for something to give up. So quit ultrasounding is what some people have done. The problem is, if you were a seed stock producer, and particularly a nucleus seed stock producer, you bear the responsibility of phenotypic data collection to ensure accurate breeding values and ensure a population where we continue to retrain. For the breeds that aren't quite there yet, they're going to have to capitalize on building their own training population. And I think it's been pretty evident that genomics has the potential to increase accuracy, particularly on young sires. In my mind, that mitigates risk for commercial bull buyers, and they should command more money. That's my opinion. I don't know that that always happens, but that's my opinion. The other thing you have to realize is that where this information impacts young bulls the most is not necessarily for something like birth weight where you have a phenotype recorded. It's for things like maternal weaning weight, heifer pregnancy, stayability, feed intake, things like that. That's where we actually get the most bang for our buck. So with that, I'll point out a few educational resources. Of course, the UNL Beef Production website, National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium website, beefefficiency.org. That's a project website for a large collaborative USDA grant, which Bob Weber will be talking about later. And the last website would be eBEEF.org. And so fellow team members are Bob Weber in here, Megan Rolfe back there, Allison up here, Dare up here, and you'll note that I am the only one wearing the t-shirt, okay? So, yeah, that doesn't count. I'm wearing it on my skin. So with that, I'll wrap up and invite any questions that you guys might have.